Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session, Advanced Lightning Components. My name is Christoph Conrads, and I'm a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and you can find me on Twitter right there. So this session is going to be about advanced Lightning Components. How many of you have actually built Lightning Components? Most of you. That's beautiful. So I need to start with an advanced Lightning component. So we're going to try something together. I have an application here with utility bar, and in my utility bar, I have an assistant. So let's bring it up, and I can say things, for instance, like, let's try, with the voice, open market report. Great. Just that the sound is not working. Okay, so this is a little bot, so we're going to try something else and try to see if we can get the sound going or not. Because if not, let's see, let's try something different. We're going to work with that Dream House sample app, so let's try 3 bedrooms in Boston. Okay, so the little bot here gives me all the different properties that match my criteria. And then, I don't know why the sound is not working. I was going to say, and that was going to be really, really cool, I was going to say this. I was going to say, unless we have a solution, it's OK. I was going to say forward-looking statements. And then the sound would have said it, and it would have been wonderful, so I wouldn't have to say it. So that was the whole idea. Thank you. So usually there is sound there, but we can totally live without. And now we don't even have to look at this, because you know it. OK, so what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about advanced topics, including advanced data access strategies. We're going to talk about the Lightning Data Service, again, pretty advanced topics, new components like the record edit form. I'll tell you little things about data binding that you may not know. And then I think what's really important when you're building components is to be able to build reusable, also known as modular code. OK, so with that, let's get started. And I wanted to show an application here. And this one is more of a financial services type of application. So I have a bunch of mutual funds. And I'm like you. I don't really know what they are. In fact, they are all fake. So it's just a bunch of things. It's just a list of things. And I'm sure that whatever the business, the vertical you're in, you deal with a bunch of things, right? And so I can filter them. So I should have some cool sliders here. You see, I can select them based on the return. Or I can go to the next page because there are a lot of them. Or I can choose. I can filter them by asset, like, for instance, equity, whatever. So I work on the same data set, but I retrieve different subsets. And now what I would like to do is show you what's really happening behind the scenes here. And as you can see, I hope you can all see this. Can you vaguely read these numbers? Yes? Maybe I can do this. OK. But I'll tell you exactly what's happening. So I'm on page 5. So I'm going to go back to all of these mutual funds, right? There are 34 pages. So let's go to page 2. And as you may see here, to go to page 2, it took 171 milliseconds. OK? That's not too bad. I have a decent network here. Page 3, 138 milliseconds. Page 4, 141 milliseconds. But what happens if I go back? Because now I want to go back to page 3, but remember, just a few seconds ago, we had page 3. Okay, so let's see what happens. 119, page 2, 122, page 1, 119, right? So that doesn't seem to be very efficient, because what it seems like it's doing, it's like, even though I had that data set or that subset of the data set just a few seconds ago, it looks like it's really going back to the server to ask for the exact same thing. Like, let's do a filter again. Let's filter by sector. I'm going to say agriculture here. Okay, it took 180 milliseconds. I'm going to go back to everything, 145, going back to agriculture, 160. So you see that there is no real caching when I go back to a previous data set. It's a full round trip to the server again. Data access is the biggest bottleneck in web applications in general, and definitely in Lightning applications as well. In web application, sometimes people ask me, okay, let's find really, sophisticated techniques to fine-tune the rendering of a page. But before you do that, I always say, look at data access, because that is really where the bottleneck is. Now, let's use some magic here to fix this problem with just one line of code. Okay, so I'm going to go to code here. And so this is my usual logic, right? I'm going to invoke a function on my controller. So the controller is an Apex class, right? And it has a getFunds method, right? And then I'm going to pass some parameters that controller expects. And then I'm going to enqueue the action, which is fancy, to say I'm going to execute that request. I'm going to send that request. But what I'm going to do now, once I get access to that remote method in my Apex controller, I'm going to uncomment this. And so on that action, which really represents your remote Apex method, I'm going to mark it storable. And what does it mean to be storable? It means really storable in the cache. Which cache? The client cache. Not a server cache, but a client cache. Okay? So now, the next time I invoke the same method with the exact same set of parameters, then instead of going round trip to the server, I'm going to pull the data set from the client cache, and it's going to make a huge difference. So let's see if that really works as expected. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to refresh that page here. And I'm back to my little console here. So let's go to page 2. We didn't have page 2, so we had to go get it. 128 milliseconds. Page 3, 200 milliseconds. Now let's go back to page 2. Ooh, look at that. 1 millisecond. You see the difference, and of course I already have page 1. I can go back to page 2, not even a millisecond. Page 3, I have it. Page 4, I don't have it. 154. Okay? Now, this is a small example. There is just one call to the server on this page. But oftentimes, you build very sophisticated pages with different things going on at the same time, different calls to Apex, and it adds up. And sometimes your page will take a second or 2 seconds to load. Look at storable actions. Now, I told you we work with a cache, so it's kind of important to understand how it really works. And there are 2 numbers that you need to remember. What we call the refresh age and what we call the expiration age. So if I make a call to a method that I just called before, less than 30 seconds ago, I'm just going to give you the data from the cache. So that's the way it works. So if you make a call to a method that you called before within 30 seconds, I'm just going to get the data from the cache and be optimistic and say, it's probably still fresh. It's still probably good. Now, if you make that call, let's say, 45 seconds after the first call, then you are in that orange zone there. I'm like, maybe it's still good, so I'll give it to you. I'll give you the data. But you know what? Just to be sure, I'm going to go check behind the scenes, and I'm going to go ask the server again and then compare and make sure that I gave you fresh data. And now if you make that call over 900 seconds later, which is 15 minutes, then I'm not even going to look at the cache. I'm going to completely ignore the cache because I'm going to say this is probably not fresh, stale data. I don't want to look at it. So to make sure we understand, let's look at the 3 possible scenarios here. So I have a component on the left that's going to make a request, like we just saw before, enqueue an action to the server. Now, you think that when you do that, you're calling the server right away, but in fact, it goes through the Lightning Component Framework. And the Lightning Component Framework tries to be smart and says, before I go to the server, let me ask the cache, do you have that data set? And in this case, the client cache is going to say, no, I don't have that data set. So the framework is then going to make the request to the server, bring it back, save that data set in the cache, and of course also send it to your component, which asked for that data set. Okay, so this is full circle. We checked the cache, but it wasn't there, so we went to the server. Now, if shortly after that, that same component, or by the way, it doesn't have to be the same component, it can be a completely different component, is going to invoke the same method with the exact same parameters, right? So I'm going to make the request. The framework is going to ask the cache, and in this case, the cache is going to say, yes, I got it, and it's less than, what was my number? 30 seconds old. I give it to you. Boom. And that's it. There is absolutely no trip to the server at this point. Okay, so, and this is what we experience together. This is where you get data in sub-millisecond times, and that's pretty awesome. And so like the third use case where you were kind of in the middle in that orange zone, so I'm making that request, the framework asks the cache says, yes, I got it, but it's old. But not very old, but it's over 30 seconds old. So the framework is going to say, let's be optimistic. I'm going to send you that response right away. Boom, you get it. But the framework wants to be responsible and says, OK, now that you're happy, you got that response, I'm going to go check with the server. So I make the request to the server. I get the response. I set it in the cache. And then if and only if the response is different from the response that I already gave you, if it's different, then you know what? I call your callback function a second time, which may surprise you the first time it happens to you. So if I look at the code here, right, remember when you invoke an Apex function, you set up a callback, right? Well, guess what? That callback function can actually be invoked twice. And in this case, it's invoked twice. The first time, you get it right away from the cache. The second time, I go check with the server, oh, the data changed. I need to call back a second time. Now, this is a new pattern that you see in many consumer applications. Like, for instance, if you open your phone and go to Facebook, right, you're going to see your feed right away. Boom, it's there. That gives you, oh, great, very responsive. But behind the scenes, they are actually checking for updates to your feed. And then, a second later, boom, you see new stuff showing up in your feed. That is the exact same pattern. We want to give you immediate feedback, make the application super responsive. But then we also want to make sure that you get fresh data. All right, so that's how storable actions work. I wanted to give you, since we had fun with voice, and this one doesn't require sound, it just input. So here is another example of a component. How many people are familiar with the Dreamhouse sample application? Number of you. OK, so here we go. I have a list of properties for sale, so I can either use traditional sliders to filter, but again, I can say 3 bedrooms in Cambridge. All right, and you see that automatically the map adjusts, and on the right you saw that it took 92 milliseconds. I'm going to say 3 bedrooms in Boston. So that is a different query, and hopefully now if I go back to 3 bedrooms in Cambridge, boom, 0.5 milliseconds, right? So everywhere in all types of applications, you can benefit from this. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the Lightning Data Service, which is another way to access your data. And the benefit, as you know, of the Lightning Data Service is that it doesn't require any Apex. You don't have to write an Apex controller, which is fine. So let's quickly review how the Lightning Data Service works, and then we'll look at some advanced use of it. So let's say that I have a first component that needs to retrieve the name and the status of some record. The Lightning Data Service is sitting there. It's some component running at the client side. It's going to say, oh, let me check, do I have that record? No. The first time, it's going to go behind the scenes to Salesforce, pull that record, and it's only going to pull the columns that you specifically asked for, because as you may know, some objects have many, many columns, so it wouldn't be very efficient to retrieve all columns. So in this case, I just ask 2, I get the ID, and then the 2 columns that I asked for. Now, if another component, shortly after that, asks for the exact same record and the exact same columns, I'm going to get that right away. There is no, in that case, the Lightning Data Service is going to say, I have that, no need to go to the server. Here it is. So again, it's using client-side cache. Now, in my third component, I'm working on the same record, but maybe it's a map component, let's say. And in this case, I need the location field, column of that same record. So I'm going to ask the Lightning Data Service for that record. And in this case, as you can see, the Lightning Data Service is going back to Salesforce just to pull, just to fetch that additional column, which is location. Okay, so it's really kind of on-demand fetching of the columns that you're asking for. Now, one of the benefits of the Lightning Data Service is the client-side cache. Another benefit of the Lightning Data Service is that it syncs data between different components. So let's take an example here. So I'm going to look for a property. Here we go. And I think I can close that for now. I'm going to add a very simple component built with the Lightning Data Service. I will show you the component in a second. OK, here we go. All right. So before I show you the code, let's see what I meant by synchronizing data. So this is the data service. You see that it's kind of a view of some of the same fields, including the price here, $6.40. OK, so let's change that price here, and I'm going to change it to $5.40. Now, look at what's going to happen on the right, and I can already tell you this doesn't require any code at all in your component. So as I change that, boom, automatically that component synchronizes the data. There is nothing worse in terms of a UI, and I see that every day on the web, than a UI that gives you inconsistent data. You know, in one component you see the value of a field that is different from the same field in another component from, in terms of user experience. That is, of course, really, really bad. OK, so let's take a look at the code that's required to make that work. So first of all, if you look at this Lightning component, you notice that there is absolutely no Apex controller involved. And in fact, there isn't even a JavaScript controller involved. This is all markup. which is wonderful. You can do all that. You can get access to data without really writing any code. So all you have to do is to implement that interface, has record ID, so it knows which record to pull. Here is the record ID. And then force record data is really the Lightning Data Service. You're going to populate that object that you specify here, and then you can do your traditional data binding, right? And as you notice, there is absolutely no code to synchronize the data when I change the price in another component. It just happens automatically. So now let's do something else. Visualizing data is fun, but editing data is even better. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to look for property data service edit. So this component is very, very similar, but instead of just viewing data, I just want to edit data. Okay? So it's there. The fields are now in input fields, and I'm going to change the price again. And I'm going to put it to 560. Okay. And what you see is that the top component actually refreshed, but the bottom component did not. And it doesn't happen automatically for a good reason that I will explain to you in a second. Let's see if the opposite works. What if I modify here, I make it 440, using my component, okay? And in this case, ooh, look, this one updated, and even the standard component here updated. So everything seems to work fine, except that when I modify the price somewhere else, this thing here didn't really update. Let's take a look at the code and figure out why. So first of all, again, there is no Apex controller. So one thing you need to know, obviously, is that to be able to edit using the data service, you need to put the data service in edit mode. Okay? And then you have an event that you can handle. It's called record updated. And it's your opportunity to do something when the record was updated somewhere else by another component. And so in this case, I'm just going to say, well, you know what? I'm just going to reload the record to make sure I get the latest value. Now, you may go for something a little more sophisticated because the user may be in the middle of editing values, and so if all of a sudden, boom, the record reloads to get the new value, I may lose, all the edits that I'm in the middle of doing. So you may actually ask the user, would you, with a pop-up, do you want to, the record has changed somewhere else? Do you want to reload? I'll leave that up to you, but I'll just show you the brute force kind of approach here. So I'm going to do this, and I'm going to change this to 430 and save, and you see that now everything worked well. This component is pretty cool, but it's not actually that cool because, look, the status of a property is like a pick list in Salesforce. The date is obviously a date field, and look, in this case, it's just a basic input field, right? And the broker is some kind of a master detail relationship, but if you look at my code, right now, I put everything just in plain input fields, which means that from a user experience point of view, this is actually bad. For instance, I could put test as a status, which obviously wouldn't be a valid value in my pick list, but for some reason it works. Or I may try to change the name of the broker, but obviously I'm making stuff up here because I'm not choosing from a pick list. And as you can see, it didn't change at all here. So this is actually a very poor user experience. And as a developer, now you have to do a lot of work to actually present a pick list to the user for status and broker, present a date picker for the date field. That is why we recently, in other words, the Lightning Data Service itself is not aware of all the wonderful metadata that we have in Salesforce. And this is why we recently introduced a a new thing called the record edit form. And the record edit form is actually built on top of the Lightning data service. But the huge advantage of record edit form is that it is metadata aware. So look, I'm again pointing to a record ID. And instead of using Lightning input, I'm using Lightning input field. And when you use Lightning input field inside a record edit form, you're telling Salesforce, hey, you should really know the data type of that field. You should know all the metadata attached to that field. So please do your magic. If it's like for broker here, look, I say input field broker. Let's see what happens when we use that component now. So I'm going to go back to the page here. I am going to get rid of these two to make some room here. And I'm going to use property record edit form. I'm going to put it right here. OK. And look what happened. When I go back, you can see that the date is a wonderful date picker. Status is automatically a pick list. And even broker, which is a master detail relationship, I can do that and then now select my new broker. But look at the code. It's just one line of code, and automatically Salesforce will do its magic to match the input field to the metadata that we know. So that is actually something really powerful, something for you to look at. It's going to save you a ton of time. OK, so we looked at record edit form. OK, so now let's shift gears, and I want to introduce you to a little-known secret related to data binding. You're all familiar with the syntax curly exclamation mark to bind data to a model, right? Everybody does that. And notice that in this specific example on my slide, this is actually happening within a loop. So that iteration, I have obviously here a list of contacts. And then for each contact, I'm going to display an input field with the first name of the contact. This is obviously a very simplified example. Now, this is super simple, simple enough to do as a developer. It's cheap to write that code. But you know what? It is not cheap to execute that code. Why? Because this is a form of two-way data binding. And every time you use curly exclamation mark, internally, and of course I simplify here with pseudocode for simplicity, but the point is, every time you use that, internally we have to set two event listeners. Two event listeners. And remember, we were in a loop there. So we need to set an event listener on the model. So contact is actually the model. It's the data. And say, if the model change, then we need to do something. And what we need to do here is update the UI element, input element. But the other thing, because it's two-way data binding, if the UI element changes, so if the user modifies the value there, then we need to set up a listener on the UI element to update the model accordingly. So what looked super cheap to write as code is actually a lot of event listeners. And if you are within loops, it becomes really a bottleneck. So that's why, I think about a year ago, we introduced Unbound Expressions. And the syntax here is curly hashtag, right? And so this is completely different. There is a misconception out there that says that this is one-way data binding. It's not even one-way data binding. It's actually one-time data binding. In other words, when we execute that loop, poof, yes, we set the value, and then we unbind. There is no event listener. That thing is never going to change automatically. OK, so let's take a quick example, looking at some code, OK, or looking at an example. Here, I have a list of properties, right? So that's a property tile list. And so we're going to look at the code here. And so one thing that I can do, so here is the iteration. I'm going through my list of property, and for each property, I'm actually nesting another component that's called property tile. But right here, when I pass the property object, I can already change that with that, okay? And then when I go in my property tile, okay, I may not do them all, but you see what I can do here? I can replace all my bindings, you know, the name, the city, the address, number of bathroom, boom. I forgot to, okay, thank you. One more. Where did I do? Oh, thank you. All right, good. You see, this is all real. I'm going to refresh, and as you can see, this is going a lot faster. No, you can't really feel it right here, but it is. And your system is actually not loaded as much. There are not so many listeners hanging in memory. Now, look at something else that I can do here. I can actually select one of these styles, and you see that I have some details components on the right, like, for instance, summary, okay? So let's see if we can actually use the same trick in summary, like, for instance, I'm definitely not going to do them all here, but maybe for, let's see, for the number of bedrooms and the number of bathrooms, I'm going to change to Unbound Expressions, okay? And I'm going to try that again. Is this going to work? Who thinks it's going to work? Sure? Okay. We need to test it, okay? So I'm going to do that. Oh, look, beds and bath is not bound anymore. I have no value. You see that? And why is that? Because the first time, let's refresh that page to really understand. When that page is created, what's the value of the property object? Null. We don't have one because we didn't select a tile yet. The unbound expression doesn't care. It binds to null. And then it unbinds, and it will never update again. Okay? So you need to be careful. Unbound expressions don't work all the time, but they work very well inside iterations, because by definition, when you create an iteration, everything that's inside the iteration tag is created dynamically. Okay? So iterations are a fantastic place to actually use unbound expression. Okay? So of course here, as I said, it was null, and after that you may change the property object, but unbound expressions don't react anymore because there is no listener hanging out. So the lesson here is, as much as you can use unbound expressions, because it's a lot faster, it's a lot cheaper, but it doesn't work all the time. Okay. This is one of my favorite topics. People ask about this all the time. In JavaScript, recent JavaScript, very recent JavaScript, you have something called modules, right? And the idea there is to be able to reuse code, right? Maybe you have that, you know, business logic that you want to reuse at the client side, or maybe you have data that you want to cache at the client side. Maybe you have some kind of a library that you want to use. How can I share code between different Lightning components? Does anybody know the LTNG require tag? Have you seen that tag? Lightning require. Lightning require is what you use if you want to leverage an external JavaScript library. Okay, you could use charting libraries, for instance, like Chart.js and things like jQuery, even though it's not always recommended. But Lightning require lets you leverage JavaScript libraries. There is absolutely no reason why you couldn't write a JavaScript library that you leverage using Lightning require, right? The same way you import Chart.js, write your own JavaScript library that you can then leverage using LTNG require. So let me show you an example of that in code. And the easiest way to write a simple JavaScript library that you can leverage in different Lightning components is to write it as a static resource, right? And so this is just a static resource. So you would go kind of file new, you go file new static resource, and then you would do application JavaScript, and that's it, right? So this is how I created this. Now, you need to attach an object to the window object. The window object is the browser window object, right? And so here, I have some logic to create a counter. It's very sophisticated logic. I have a counter that I can increment. I can't actually decrement it, maybe in the next release, but I can get the value of that counter. So that counter has two methods, increment and get value, and of course, I just keep the value in a kind of an instance variable, right? Okay, so let's see that in action. Let's say that I want to actually use that counter. So here's a page. I'm going to edit it. And I have a component called counter. And I'm going to, just for fun, I'm going to paste 2 instances of it here. And I'm going to save, and we'll go back. Okay? And so here, in the first component, I'm going to start incrementing. And now, in the second component, I'm going to get the value. So you see, it knows the value because not only do we share code, but we potentially also share data. And I can increment it here. And now when I do get value here, I get that new value. So these 2 components share the same counter library. Does that make sense? So let's take a look at the code for the counter library. I need to open it. Here it is. OK. So as you can see here, what I'm doing, I'm using LTNG require to load that counter library that I just showed you, which is that static resource with the counter object attached to the window object, okay? And then look what I'm doing when I say increment here. I call increment in my client-side controller. So look what I'm doing here. I'm really accessing window.counter, and I'm calling increment. That's all, right? And so when I want to do get value, it's the same thing. Window.counter get value. I'm really calling these 2 methods here. Sometimes, though, you don't want that singleton, right? So sometimes you don't want the data to be shared between components. So here is another pattern where you use actually a kind of a JavaScript module pattern to instantiate your own version of that library, okay? And in that case, I will show you immediately in the component itself what's happening there. So again, I'm calling my counter2 library. And then there is an event here. After scripts loaded, I execute JS loaded here. And in JS loaded, I'm actually I'm creating a new version of that object just for me, which means that my instance of the Lightning component will have its own instance of the counter library. So this is just a different pattern depending on what you need. Do you need to share data between components, or do you want your own version of the data? And let's quickly take a look at the difference here. Okay, so I'm going to go back here, and in this case, I'm going to paste 2 instances of counter2. Okay, let's do that. Okay, and here, I'm going to start incrementing get value. That's fine. When I get value here, you see that it's 0. So it's not sharing the value of the other instance, but I can increment here and do get value, but that didn't impact the other component there. Quickly to show you this in a more real-life example. So here, let's take a component here. So here is an example where I have actually a mortgage calculator that I can use here at the top, and then the bottom component is actually showing an amortization chart for the values of that mortgage, right? So here, I really have some business logic. You know, how do I calculate the monthly payment of a mortgage, right? So that is some real legitimate business logic that I would like to execute at the client side. And so this is, again, something that you would want to do as a static resource. Let's do it here. Open. OK, so again, I attach a mortgage object to window, and then, of course, in this case, I have just a simple method, calculate monthly payment. And now I don't have to cut and paste. I see sometimes when I review code, I see people, you know, cutting and pasting logic between components. That's not good, obviously. If you have you know, shared logic, it should be written once, and this is one way you can do it using a JavaScript library that you leverage using Lightning Require. All right, well, that is actually the end of my presentation. So just to summarize, the number one thing you can do tonight when you go back home or to your hotel room is add one line of code everywhere. And what is that line of code again? Set storable. Action set storable. Cache with Lightning Data Service. We can do even better now with record edit form because you leverage all the metadata. Use Unbound Expression whenever, wherever possible, and specifically inside iterations. That's going to make a huge difference. And then write modular code. Don't repeat yourself. Don't duplicate code. Every time you find yourself in that position, extract that code and put it in a JavaScript library that you can actually reuse between Lightning components. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming today. Thank you. I ran a little late, so I want to give a chance to the next speaker, but I will be hanging out either here or outside if you have questions. Thank you so much.